Hi guys, before we start chapter number 3, let's recall what we learned in chapter number 2. That is from trade to territory. The company establishes power. After his death in 1707, many Mughal governors, subedars and big jamindars began asserting their authority and establishing regional kingdoms. By the second half of the 18th century, however, a new power was emerging on the political horizon, that is the British. In 1600, the East India Company acquired a charter from the ruler of England, Queen Elizabeth I, granting it the sole right to trade with the East. This means that no other trading group in England could compete with the East India Company. The company did not have to fear competition from other English trading companies. Mercantile trading companies in those days make profit primarily by excluding competition so that they could buy cheap and sell there. The Portuguese had already established their presence in the western coast of India and had their base in Goa. In fact, it was Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, who had discovered this sea route to India in 1498. By the early 17th century, the Dutch too were exploring the possibilities of trade in the Indian Ocean. Soon the French traders arrived on the scene. The problem was that all the companies were interested in buying the same things. The fine qualities of cotton and silk produced in India had a big market in Europe. Pepper, cloves, cardamom, and cinnamon too were in great demand. Competition amongst the European companies inevitably pushed up the prices at which these goods could be purchased, and this reduced the profits that could be earned. The only way the trading companies could flourish was by eliminating rival competitors. The urge to secure markets therefore led to fierce battles between the trading companies. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, they regularly sank each other's ships, blockaded routes, and prevented rival ships from moving with supplies of goods. Trade was carried on with arms, and trading posts were protected through fortification. The company therefore found it difficult to separate trade and politics. So the first English factory was set up on the banks of the river Hooghly in 1651. This was the base from which the company's traders, known at the time as factors, operated. The factory had a warehouse where goods for export were stored, and it had offices where company officials sat. By 1696, it began building a fort around the settlement. 2 years later, it bribed Mughal officials into giving the company jamindari rights over 3 villages. One of these was Kalikatta, which later grew into the city of Calcutta or Kolkata, as it is known today. It also persuaded the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to issue a farman granting the company the right to trade duty-free. Aurangzeb's farman, for instance, had granted only the company the right to trade duty-free, but officials of the company who were carrying on private trade on the side were expected to pay duty. This they refused to pay, causing an enormous loss of revenue for Bengal. Through the early 18th century, the conflict between the company and the Nawabs of Bengal intensified. After the death of Aurangzeb, the Bengal Nawabs asserted their power and autonomy, as other regional powers were doing at that time. Murshid Qali Khan was followed by Ali Vardi Khan and then Siraj-ud-Daulah as the Nawab of Bengal. Each one of them was a strong ruler. They refused to grant the company concessions, demanded large tributes for the company's right to trade, denied it any right to mint coins, and stopped it from extending its fortification. Accusing the company of deceit, they claimed that the company was depriving the Bengal government of huge amounts of revenue and undermining the authority of the Nawab. It was also convinced that to expand trade, the East India Company had to enlarge its settlements by villages and rebuild its forts. The conflicts led to confrontations and finally culminated in the famous Battle of Plassey. When Alivardi Khan died in 1756, Siraj-ud-Daulah became the Nawab of Bengal. The company was worried about his power and keen on a puppet ruler who would willingly give trade concessions and other privileges. So, an infuriated Siraj-ud-Daulah asked the company to stop meddling in the political affairs of his dominion, stop fortification, and pay the revenues. After negotiations failed and the Nawab marched with 30,000 soldiers to the English factory at Qasim Bazar, captured the company officials, locked the warehouse, disarmed old Englishmen, and blockaded English ships. On hearing the news of the fall of Calcutta, company officials in Madras sent forces under the command of Robert Clive, reinforced by naval fleets. Prolonged negotiations with the Nawab followed. Finally, in 1757, Robert Clive led the company's army against Siraj-ud-Daulah at Plassey. One of the main reasons for the defeat of Nawab was that the forces led by Mir Jafar, one of Siraj-ud-Daulah's commanders, never fought the battle. Clive had managed to secure his support by promising to make him Nawab after crushing Siraj-ud-Daulah. The Battle of Plassey became famous because it was the first major victory the company won in India. After the defeat of Plassey, Siraj-ud-Daulah was assassinated and Mir Jafar made the Nawab. Its prime objective was the expansion of trade. For even the puppet Nawabs were not always as helpful as the company wanted them to be. After all, they had to maintain a basic appearance of dignity and sovereignty if they wanted respect from their subjects. What could the company do? When Mir Jafar protested, the company deposed him and installed Mir Qasim in his place. When Mir Qasim complained, he in turn was defeated in a battle fought at Buxar, 1764, driven out of Bengal, and Mir Jafar was reinstalled. The Nawab had to pay rupees 500,000 every month. But the company wanted more money to finance its wars and meet the demands of trade and its other expenses. By the time Mir Jafar died in 1765, the mood of the company had changed. Having failed to work with puppet Nawabs, Clive declared, "We must indeed become Nawabs ourselves." Finally, in 1765, the Mughal emperor appointed the company as the Diwan of the provinces of Bengal. The Diwani allowed the company to use the vast revenue resources of Bengal. but it had to buy most of the goods in India with gold and silver imported from Britain. This was because at this time Britain had no goods to sell in India. The outflow of gold from Britain slowed after the Battle of Plassey and entirely stopped after the assumption of Diwani. Now revenues from India could finance company expenses. These revenues could be used to purchase cotton and silk textiles in India, maintain company troops, and meet the cost of building the company fort and offices at Calcutta. The company acquired more power and authority. Each company servant began to have visions of living like Nawabs. After the Battle of Plassey, the actual Nawabs of Bengal were forced to give land and vast sums of money as personal gifts to company officials. Robert Clive himself amassed a fortune in India. He had come to Madras, now Chennai, from England in 1743 at the age of 18. When in 1767 he left India, his Indian fortune was worth £401,102. Interestingly, when he was appointed Governor of Bengal in 1764, he was asked to remove corruption in company administration, but he was himself cross-examined in 1772 by the British Parliament, which was suspicious of his vast wealth. The company rarely launched a direct military attack on an unknown territory. Instead, it used a variety of political, economic, and diplomatic methods to expand its influence before annexing an Indian kingdom. In the Battle of Buxar 1764, after the battle, the company appointed residents in Indian states. They were political or commercial agents, and their job was to serve and further the interest of the company. Through the residents, the company officials began interfering in the internal matters of Indian states. They tried to decide who was to be the successor to the throne and who was to be appointed in administrative post. Sometimes the company forced the states into a subsidiary alliance. According to the terms of this alliance, Indian rulers were not allowed to have their independent armed forces. They were to be protected by the company, but had to pay for the subsidiary forces that the company was supposed to maintain for the purpose of this protection. If the Indian rulers failed to make the payment, then part of their territory was taken away as penalty. For example, when Richard Wellesley was Governor General, the Nawab of Awadh was forced to give over half of his territory to the company in 1801 as he failed to pay for the subsidiary forces. Hyderabad was also forced to cede territories on similar grounds. So, the company resorted to direct military confrontation when it saw a threat to its political or economic interest. This can be illustrated with the case of the southern Indian state of Mysore. Mysore had grown in strength under the leadership of powerful rulers like Hyder Ali and his famous son Tipu Sultan. Mysore controlled the profitable trade of the Malabar coast, where the company purchased pepper and cardamom. In 1785, Tipu Sultan stopped the export of sandalwood, pepper, and cardamom through the ports of his kingdom, and this allowed local merchants from trading with the company. He also established a close relationship with the French in India and modernized his army with their help. They saw Hyder and Tipu as ambitious, arrogant, and dangerous rulers who had to be controlled and crushed. Four wars were fought with Mysore. Only in the last, the Battle of Seringapatam, did the company ultimately win a victory. Tipu Sultan was killed defending his capital Seringapatam. Mysore was placed under the former ruling dynasty of Wadeyars, and a subsidiary alliance was imposed on the state. War with the Marathas. With their defeat in the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, the Marathas' dream of ruling from Delhi was shattered. They were divided into many states under different chiefs, belonging to dynasties such as Sindhya, Holkar, Gaikwad, and Bhonsle. These chiefs were held together in a confederacy, that is, an alliance, under a Peshwa, principal minister, who became its effective military and administrative head, based in Pune. Mahaji Sindhya and Nana Fatnis were two famous Maratha soldiers and statesmen of the late 18th century. The Marathas were subdued in a series of wars. In the first war, that ended in 1782 with the Treaty of Salbai, there was no clear victory. The Second Anglo-Maratha War was fought on different fronts, resulting in the British gaining Orissa and the territories north of the Yamuna River, including Agra and Delhi. The Third Anglo-Maratha War crushed Maratha power. The Peshwa was removed and sent away to Bithur near Kanpur with a pension. The company now had complete control over the territory south of the Vindhyas. The company pursued an aggressive policy of territorial expansion. Under Lord Hastings, a new policy of paramountcy was initiated. Now the company claimed that its authority was paramount or supreme, hence its power was greater than that of Indian states. For example, when the British tried to annex the small state of Kittur in Karnataka today, Rani Channamma took the arms and led an anti-British resistance movement. She was arrested in 1824 and died in prison in 1829. In the late 1930s, the East India Company became worried about Russia. It imagined that Russia might expand across Asia and enter India from the northwest. They fought a prolonged war with Afghanistan and established indirect company rule there. Sindh was taken over in 1843. Next in line was Punjab, but the presence of Maharaja Ranjit Singh held back the company. After his death in 1839, two prolonged wars were fought with the Sikh kingdom. Ultimately, in 1849, Punjab was annexed. So let's come to Lord Dalhousie. He devised a policy that came to be known as the Doctrine of Lapse. The doctrine declared that if an Indian ruler died without a male heir, his kingdom would lapse, that is, become part of company territory. So, like this, Satara, Sambalpur, Udaipur, Nagpur, and Jhansi, they were annexed. And in 1856, the company also took over Awadh. This time the British had an added argument. They said they were obliged by duty to take over Awadh in order to free the people from the misgovernment of the Nawab. So then Warren Hastings came. By his time, the company had acquired power not only in Bengal but also in Bombay and Madras. British territories were broadly divided into administrative units called presidencies. There were three presidencies: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Each was ruled by a governor. The supreme head of the administration was the Governor General. Warren Hastings, the first Governor General, introduced several administrative reforms, notably in the sphere of justice. From 1772, a new system of justice was established. Each district was to have two courts. Number one, a criminal court, that is Faujdari Adalat, and second one was a civil court, that is Diwani Adalat. Maulvis and Hindu Pandits interpreted Indian laws for the European district collectors who presided over civil courts. The criminal courts were still under a Qazi and a Mufti, but under the supervision of the collectors. The Brahman Pandits gave different interpretations of local laws based on different schools of the Dharma Shastra. To find to bring about uniformity, in 1775 11 Pandits were asked to compile a digest of Hindu laws. And in 1778 a code of Muslim laws was also compiled for the benefit of European judges. Under the Regulating Act of 1773, a new Supreme Court was established. The principal figure in an Indian district was the collector. Then about the military, the Mughal army was mainly composed of cavalry and infantry, that is, paddle soldiers. They were given training in archery and the use of the sword. The cavalry dominated the army, and the Mughal state did not feel the need to have a large professionally trained infantry. The East India Company adopted the same method when it began recruiting for its own army, which came to be known as Savoy Army, from the Indian word sipahi, meaning soldiers. And the soldiers, they were armed with muskets and matchlocks. The soldiers of the company's army had to keep pace with the changing military requirement, and its infantry regiments now became more important. So they used the steamships, reduced the journey time to 3 weeks, enabling more Britishers and their families to come to India. And by 1857, the company came to exercise direct rule over about 63% of the territory and 78% of the population of the Indian subcontinent. So now let's start chapter number 3. Let's start chapter number 3, ruling the countryside. So this figure number 1 shows Robert Clive accepting the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa from the Mughal ruler in 1765. The company becomes the Diwan. In 12th August 1765, the Mughal emperor appointed the East India Company as the Diwan of Bengal. The actual event most probably took place in Robert Clive's tent, with a few Englishmen and Indians as witnesses. But in the painting above, the event is shown as a majestic occasion taking place in a grand setting. The painter was commissioned by Clive to record the memorable events in Clive's life. The grant of Diwani clearly was one such event in British imagination. As Diwan, the company became the chief beneficial administrator of the territory under its control. Now it had to think of administering the land and organizing its revenue resources. This had to be done in a way that could yield enough revenue to meet the growing expenses of the company. A trading company had also to ensure that it could buy the products it needed and sell what it wanted. So, over the years, the company also learned that it had to move with some caution. Being an alien power, it needed to pacify those who in the past had ruled the countryside and enjoyed authority and prestige. Those who had held local power had to be controlled, but they could not be entirely eliminated. How was this to be done? In this chapter, we will see how the company the came to colonize the countryside, organize revenue resources, redefine the rights of people, and produce the crops it wanted. So let's see the revenue for the company. So the company had become the Diwan, but it still saw itself primarily as a trader. It wanted a large revenue income, but was unwilling to set up any regular system of assessment and collection. The effort was to increase the revenue as much as it could and buy fine cotton and silk cloth as cheaply as possible. Within 5 years, the value of goods bought by the company in Bengal doubled. Before 1865, the company had purchased goods in India by importing gold and silver from Britain. Now, the revenue collected in Bengal could finance the purchase of goods for exports. So this figure number 2, this is a weekly market in Murshidabad in Bengal. Peasants and artisans from rural areas regularly came to these weekly markets, huts, to sell their goods and buy what they needed. These markets were badly affected during the times of economic crisis. Now, soon it was clear that the Bengal economy was facing a deep crisis. Artisans were deserting villages since they were being forced to sell their goods to the company at low prices. Peasants were unable to pay the dues that were being demanded from them. Artisanal production was in decline, and agricultural cultivation showed signs of collapse. Then, in 1770, a terrible famine killed 10 million people in Bengal. About 1/3 of the population was wiped out in 1770 because of a terrible famine. So the need to improve agriculture. This figure number 3 is Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis was the Governor General of India when the permanent settlement was introduced. The need to improve agriculture. If the economy was in ruins, could the company be certain of its revenue income? Most company officials began to feel that investment in land had to be encouraged and agriculture had to be improved. Investment in land. Question: how was this to be done? After 2 decades of debate on the question, the company finally introduced the permanent settlement in 1793. By the terms of the settlement, the Rajas and Talukdars were recognized as jamindars. They were asked to collect rent from the peasants and pay revenue to the company. The amount to be paid was fixed permanently. That is, it was not to be increased ever in future. It was felt that this would ensure a regular flow of revenue into the company's coffers and at the same time encourage the jamindars to invest in improving the land, since the revenue demand of the state would not be increased. The jamindar would benefit from increased production from the land. So we have a source. This is the Colebrook on Bengal Riots. On Bengal Riots. In many villages of Bengal, some of the powerful riots did not cultivate, but instead gave out their hands to others, the under-tenants, taking from them very high rents. In 1806, H. D. Colebrook described the conditions of these under-tenants in Bengal. The under-tenants, depressed by an excessive rent in kind and by usurious returns for the cattle, seed, and subsistence advanced to them, can never extricate themselves from debt. In so abject a state, they cannot labor in spirit, while they earn a scanty subsistence without hope of bettering their situation. So the problem. The permanent settlement, however, created problems. Many officials soon discovered that the jamindars were in fact not investing in the improvement of land. The revenue that had been fixed was so high that the jamindar found it difficult to pay. Anyone who failed to pay the revenue lost his jamindari. Numerous jamindaris were sold off at auctions organized by the company. By the first decade of the 19th century, the situation changed. The prices in the market rose, and cultivation slowly expanded. This meant an increase in the income of the jamindars, but no gain for the company, since it could not increase a revenue demand that had been fixed permanently. Even when the jamindars did not have an interest in improving the land, some had lost their lands in the earlier years of the settlement. Others now saw the possibility of earning without the trouble and risk of investment. As long as the jamindars could give out the land to tenants and get rent, they were not interested in improving the land. On the other hand, in the villages, the cultivator found the system extremely oppressive. The rent he paid to the jamindar was high and his right on the land was insecure. To pay the rent, he had to often take a loan from the moneylender, and when he failed to pay the rent, he was evicted from the land he had cultivated for generations. So a new system is devised. By the early 19th century, many of the company officials were convinced that the system of revenue has to be changed again. How could revenues be fixed permanently at a time when the company needed more money to meet its expenses of administration and trade? In the northwestern provinces of the Bengal Presidency, most of this area is now in Uttar Pradesh, and Englishmen called Holt Mackenzie devised a new system which came into effect in 1822. He felt that the village was an important social institution in North Indian society and needed to be preserved. He felt that the village was an important social institution in North Indian society and needed to be preserved. Under his direction, collectors went from village to village, inspecting the land, measuring the fields, and recording the customs and rights of different groups. The estimated revenue of each plot within a village was added up to calculate the revenue that each village mahal had to pay. So, So let's see what is this mahal. In British revenue records, mahal is a revenue estate which may be a village or a group of villages. This demand was to be revised periodically, not permanently fixed. The charge of collecting the revenue and paying it to the company was given to the village headman rather than the jamindar. This system came to be known as the Mahalwari settlement. Okay, this is the Mahalwari settlement. So this figure number 4 is Thomas Munro, governor of Madras from 1819 to 26. Now let's see the Munro system. In the British territories in the south, there was a similar move away from the idea of permanent settlement. The new system that was devised came to be known as the Yotwar or Yotwari. It was tried on a small scale by Captain Alexander Reid in some of the areas that were taken over by the company after the wars with Tipu Sultan, subsequently developed by Thomas Munro. This system was gradually extended all over South India. Reid and Munro felt that in the south there were no traditional jamindars. There were no traditional jamindars. The settlement, they argued, had to be made directly with the cultivators, Yots, who had tilled the land for generations. Their fields had to be carefully and separately surveyed before the revenue assessment was made. Munro thought that the British should act as paternal father figure protecting the yachts under their charge. All was not well. Within a few years after the new system were installed, it was clear that all was not well with them. Driven by the desire to increase the income from land, revenue officials fixed too high a revenue demand. Peasants were unable to pay. Yachts fled the countryside and villages became deserted in many reasons. Optimistic officials had imagined that the new system would transform the peasants into rich, enterprising farmers, but this did not happen. Crops for Europe. The British also realized that the countryside could not only yield revenue, it could also grow the crops that Europe required. By the late 18th century, the company was trying its best to expand the cultivation of opium and indigo. In the century and a half that followed, the British persuaded or forced cultivators in various parts of India to produce other crops: jute in Bengal, tea in Assam, sugarcane in the United Provinces, now Uttar Pradesh, wheat, wheat in Punjab, cotton in Maharashtra and Punjab, rice in Madras. How was this done? The British used a variety of methods to expand the cultivation of crops that they needed. Let us take a closer look at the story of one such crop, one such method of production. Does color have a history? So figure number 5 is a kalamkari print, 20th century India, and figure number 6 is a Morris cotton print, late 19th century England. Figures 5 and 6 are two images of cotton prints. The image on the left, figure number 5, shows a kalamkari print created by weavers of Andhra Pradesh in India. Andhra Pradesh in India. On the right is a floral cotton print designed and produced by William Morris, a famous poet and artist of 19th century Britain. There is one thing common in the two prints. Both use a rich blue color, commonly called indigo. Do you know how this color was produced? The blue that you see in these prints was produced from a plant called indigo. It is likely that the blue dye used in the Morris print in the 19th century Britain was manufactured from indigo plants cultivated in India, for India was the biggest supplier of indigo in the world at that time. Why the demand for the Indian indigo? The indigo plant grows primarily in the tropics. By the 13th century, Indian indigo was being used by cloth manufacturers in Italy, Britain, and France to dye cloth. However, only small amounts of Indian indigo reached the European market and its price was very high. European cloth manufacturers therefore had to depend on another plant called woad to make violet and blue dyes. Being a plant of the temperate zones, woad was more easily available in Europe. It was grown in northern Italy, southern France, and in parts of Germany and Britain. Worried by the competition from indigo, wood producers in Europe pressurized their government to ban the import of indigo. Cloth dyers, however, preferred indigo as a dye. Indigo produced a rich blue color, whereas the dye from wood was pale and dull. By the 17th century, European cloth producers persuaded their government to relax the ban on indigo import. The French began cultivating indigo in Saint Dominique, Saint Dominique, Dominique in the Caribbean islands, the Portuguese in Brazil, the English in Jamaica, and the Spanish in Venezuela. Indigo plantations also came up in many parts of North America. By the end of the 18th century, the demand for Indian indigo grew further. Britain began to industrialize and its cotton production expanded dramatically, creating an enormous new demand for cloth dyes. While the demand for indigo increased, its existing supplies from the West Indies and America collapsed for a variety of reasons. Between 1783 and 1789, the production of indigo in the world fell by half. Cloth dyers in Britain now desperately looked for new sources of indigo supply. From where could this indigo be produced? Britain turns to India. Faced with the rising demand for indigo in Europe, the company in India looked for ways to expand the area under indigo cultivation. So, what's the meaning of plantation? Plantation is a large farm operated by a planter employing various forms of forced labor. Plantations are associated with the production of coffee, sugarcane, tobacco, tea, and cotton. Okay, so let's see. The figure number 7 is the slave revolt in St. Dominic, August 1791, painting by January Suhodolsky. In the 18th century, French planters produced indigo and sugar in the French colony of Saint Dominic in the Caribbean islands. The African slaves who worked on the plantations rose in rebellion in 1791, burning the plantations and killing their rich planters. In 1792, France abolished slavery in the French colonies. These events led to the collapse of the indigo plantations on the Caribbean islands. Okay. From the last decades of the 18th century, indigo cultivation in Bengal expanded rapidly and Bengal indigo came to dominate the world market. In 1788, only about 30% of the indigo imported into Britain was from India. By 1810, the proportion had gone up to 95%. As the indigo trade grew, commercial agents and officials of the company began investing in indigo production. Over the years, many company officials left their jobs to look after their indigo business. Attracted by the prospect of high profits, numerous Scotsmen and Englishmen came to India and became planters. Those who had no money to produce indigo could get loans from the company and the banks that were coming up at the time. How was indigo cultivated? There were two main systems of indigo cultivation, niche and yoti. Within the system of niche cultivation, the planter produced indigo in lands that he directly controlled. He either bought the land or rented it from other jamindars and produced indigo by directly employing hired laborers. The problem with niche cultivation: the planters found it difficult to expand the area under niche cultivation. Indigo could be cultivated only on fertile land, and these were all already densely populated. Only small plots scattered over the landscape could be acquired. Planters needed large areas in compact blocks to cultivate indigo in plantation. Planters needed large areas in compact blocks to cultivate indigo in plantations. Where could they get such land from? They attempted to lease in the land around the indigo factory and evict the peasants from the area, but this always led to conflicts and tension. So, who is a slave? It's a person who is owned by someone else, the slave owner. A slave has no freedom and is compelled to work for the master. Okay, nor was labor easy to mobilize. A large plantation required a vast number of hands to operate, and labor was needed precisely at a time when peasants were usually busy with rice cultivation. Niche cultivation on a large scale also required many plows and bullocks. One bigha would be a unit of measurement of land. Before British rule, the size of this area varied. In Bengal, the British standardized it to about one third of an acre. So 1 bigha of indigo cultivation required 2 plows. This meant that a planter with 1,000 bigha would need 2,000 plows. Investing on purchase and maintenance of plows was a big problem. Nor could supplies be easily got from the peasants since their plows and bullocks were busy on their rice fields. Again, exactly at the time that the indigo planters needed them. Till the late 19th century, planters were therefore reluctant to expand the area under niche cultivation. Less than 25% of the land producing indigo was under this system. The rest was under an alternative mode of cultivation, the Yoti system. So, indigo on the land of yachts. Under the Yoti system, the planters forced the yachts to sign a contract, an agreement, satta. At times, they pressurized the village headman to sign the contract on behalf of the yachts. Those who signed the contract got cash advances from the planters at low rates of interest to produce indigo. But the loan committed the yacht to cultivating indigo on at least 25% of the area under his holding. The planter provided the seed and drill while the cultivators prepared the soil, sowed the seed and looked after the crop. So figure number 8, it shows the workers harvesting indigo in early 19th century Bengal. From Colesworthy Grant, Rural Life in Bengal, 1860. In India, the indigo plant was cut mostly by men. So this figure number 9, the indigo plant being brought from the fields to the factory. How was indigo produced? Okay, so let's come to how was indigo produced. So this is the fermenting vat and this is the bitter vat. Then figure number 10, an indigo factory located near indigo fields, painting by William Simpson, 1863. The indigo villages. The indigo villages were usually around indigo factories owned by planters. After harvest, the indigo plant was taken to the vats in the indigo factory. So what are vats? Vat is a fermenting or storage vessel. So they were sent to the vats in the indigo factory. 3 or 4 vats were needed to manufacture the dye. Each vat had a separate function. The leaves, stripped off the indigo plant, were first soaked in warm water in a vat known as the fermenting or stipper vat for several hours. When the plants fermented, the liquid began to boil and bubble. Now the rotten leaves were taken out and the liquid drained into another vat that was placed just below the first vat. In the second vat, known as the beta vat, the solution was continuously stirred and beaten with paddles. When the liquid gradually turned green and then blue, lime water was added to the vat. Gradually, the indigo separated out in flakes. A muddy sediment settled at the bottom of the vat, and a clear liquid rose to the surface. The liquid was drained off, and the sediment, the indigo pulp, transferred to another vat known as the settling vat, and then pressed and dried for sale. So, this is how indigo is being made. So indigo dye is being made. Okay, so figure number 11, these it shows women usually carry the indigo plant to the vats. So figure number 12, the vat beater, the indigo worker here is standing with the paddle that was used to stir the solution in the vat. These workers had to remain in waist deep water for over 8 hours to beat the indigo solution. Then we have got figure number 13. The indigo is ready for sale. Here you can see the last stage of the production. Workers stamping and cutting the indigo pulp that has been pressed and molded. In the background you can see a worker carrying away the blocks for drying. Okay. So when the crop was delivered to the planter after the harvest, a new loan was given to the yacht and the cycle started all over again. Peasants who were initially tempted by the loans soon realized how harsh the system was. The price they got for the indigo they produced was very low, and the cycle of loans never ended. There were other problems too. The planters usually insisted that indigo be cultivated on the best soils in which peasants preferred to cultivate rice. Indigo, moreover, had deep roots and it exhausted the soil rapidly. After an indigo harvest, the land could not be sown for rice. Now let's see the source too. Okay. A song from an indigo producing village. In moments of struggle, people often sing songs to inspire each other and to build a sense of collective unity. Such songs give us a glimpse of their feelings. During the Indigo Rebellion, many such songs could be heard in the villages of Lower Bengal. Here is one such song. Okay. The long lathes wielded by the planter of Molahati or now lie in a cluster. The Babas of Kolkata have sailed down, or to see the great fight. This time the Riots are all ready. They will no longer be beaten in silence. They will no longer give up their life or without fighting the Lathial, the Lathials. Now let's see the Blue Rebellion and after. So in March 1859, thousands of riots in Bengal refused to grow indigo. They refused to grow indigo. As the rebellion spread, riots refused to pay rents to the planters and attacked indigo factories armed with swords and spears, bows and arrows. Women turned up to fight with pots, pans, and kitchen implements. Those who worked for the planters were socially boycotted, and the gomastas, agents of planters who came to collect rent, were beaten up. Riots swore they would no longer take advances to sow indigo nor be bullied by the planters' Lathials. The Lathi wielding strong men maintained by the planters. Why did the indigo peasants decide that they would no longer remain silent? What gave them the power to rebel? Clearly, the indigo system was intensely oppressive, but those who are oppressed do not always rise up in rebellion, they do so only at times. In 1859, the Indigo Riots felt that they had the support of the local jamindars. They had the support of the local jamindars and village headmen in their rebellion against the planters. In many villages, headmen who had been forced to sign indigo contracts mobilized the indigo peasants and fought pitched battles with the Lathials. In other places, when the jamindars went around villages urging the riots to resist the planters, these jamindars were unhappy with the increasing power of the planters and angry at being forced by the planters to give them land on long leashes. The indigo peasants also imagined that the British government would support them in their struggle against the planters. After the revolt of 1857, the British government was particularly worried about the possibility of another popular rebellion. When the news spread of a simmering revolt in the indigo districts, the lieutenant governor toured the region in the winter of 1859. The Riots saw the tour as a sign of government sympathy for their plight. When in Barasat, the magistrate Ashley Eden issued a notice stating that Riots would not be compelled to accept indigo contracts. Word went around that Queen Victoria had declared that indigo need not be sown. Eden was trying to placate the peasants and control an explosive situation, but his action was read as support for the rebellion. As the rebellion spread, intellectuals from Calcutta rushed to the indigo districts. They wrote of the misery of the riots, the tyranny of the planters, and the horrors of the indigo system. Worried by the rebellion, the government brought in the military to protect the planters from assault and set up the Indigo Commission to inquire into the system of indigo production. The commission held the planters guilty and criticized them for the coercive methods they used with indigo cultivators. It declared that indigo production was not profitable for riots. The commission asked the riots to fulfill their existing contracts but also told them that they could refuse to produce indigo in future. Then we have got source 3. I would rather beg than sow indigo. Haji Mullah, an indigo cultivator of Chandpur, Thana Hardi, was interviewed by the members of the Indigo Commission on Tuesday, 5th July 1860. This is what he said in answer to some of the questions. W.S. Satankar, President of the Indigo Commission. Are you now willing to sow indigo? And if not, on what fresh terms would you be willing to do it? Haji Mullah, I am not willing to sow, and I don't know that any fresh terms would satisfy me. Mr. Sale, would you not be willing to sow at a rupee a bundle? Haji Mullah, no, I would not. Rather than sow indigo, I'll go to another country. I would rather beg than sow indigo. After the revolt, indigo production collapsed in Bengal. So it collapsed. But the planters now shifted their operation to Bihar. They shifted to Bihar. With the discovery of synthetic dyes, in the late 19th century, their business was severely affected, but yet they managed to expand production. When Mahatma Gandhi returned from South Africa, a peasant from Bihar persuaded him to visit Champaran and see the plight of the indigo cultivators there. Mahatma Gandhi's visit in 1917 marked the beginning of the Champaran movement against the indigo planters. So, elsewhere in the world, what's happening? Let's find out. Indigo making in the West Indies. In the early 18th century, a French missionary, Jean Baptiste Labat, traveled to the Caribbean islands and wrote extensively about the reason. Published in one of his books, this image shows all the stages of indigo production in the French slave plantations of the region. Figure number 14 shows the making indigo in a Caribbean slave plantation. You can see the slave workers putting the indigo plant into the settler vat on the left. Another worker is churning the liquid with a mechanical churner in a vat, second from right. Two workers are carrying the indigo pulp hung up in bags to be dried. In the foreground, two others are mixing the indigo pulp to be put into molds. The planter is at the center of the picture, standing on the high ground supervising the slave workers. So let's do match the following. So riots, they are peasants, mahal, village, niche, cultivation on planters' owned land. Then rioti, it would be cultivation on riots land. Then let's do match. Let's do fill in the blanks. Number A, growers of wood in Europe sow indigo as a crop, which would provide competition to their earnings. Number B, the demand for indigo increased in late 18th century Britain because of expansion of cotton production. Then number C, the international demand for indigo was affected by the discovery of synthetic dyes. Number D, the Champaran movement was against indigo planters. So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.